Beginning in 1943, differences began to emerge between American and British support for the Polish government in exile in London, and Soviet pressure to have the Poles accept the territorial changes the Soviets made in 1939 due to the Stalin Pact with Hitler, meaning the loss of the eastern third of Poland to the Soviet Union. Reluctantly, the Western Allies also had to accept that Stalin planned to keep and incorporate the small Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union. They had been independent from 1918 to 1940, when Stalin invaded as part of the Hitler-Stalin Pact to divide Eastern Europe between Germany and USSR. FDR realized that there was little England or the US could do to stop Stalin from seizing the Baltic states once they were liberated from the Germans. But he hoped to strike a compromise with Stalin on the boundaries of Poland. Polish-Soviet relations were further strained by the revelations of the Katyn Forest massacre. Stalin had ordered the murder of 10,000 Polish soldiers, many of them officers, in 1940. For wartime unity, the British and Americans blamed the Germans, although both governments suspected it was Stalin who ordered the killings. Then in 1944, Stalin stopped the Soviet forces outside of Warsaw, allowing the Germans to put down an uprising of the Polish Home Army, the Polish Underground, resulting in the deaths of 100,000 Poles in Warsaw before the Soviets finally liberated the city from the Germans. Stalin wanted the Polish Home Army decimated so they could not put up resistance to a Soviet-imposed communist Lublin government. The Soviet-created government replaced the Polish government in exile, and Stalin refused to allow the return of the Western-oriented London-based government. Efforts to expand the government to include members of the London government became a major issue at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, but Stalin remained firm. He wanted a communist-controlled government that was pro-Soviet in Warsaw, and he demanded that the government accept the territorial changes. In compensation, he suggested the Poles be given German territory on the west. The present German-Polish boundaries of 2015 were created by Stalin before the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Truman and Churchill resisted the boundary changes at Potsdam, but Stalin refused to budge. Stalin annexed the northern part of eastern Prussia from Germany, still Russian-controlled enclave between Poland and Lithuania, giving the Polish the southern half as well as the German provinces of West Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. Truman and Churchill objected to this as a de facto addition of the Poles as the fifth occupying force in Germany after the war without the approval of the United States and England. It also left the United States and Great Britain responsible for as many as 9 million displaced Germans who entered the western zones of occupation in Germany. As the war ended, the Soviets created communist-controlled governments in Bulgaria and Romania and communist-dominated governments in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The Russians also annexed the eastern region of Ruthenia without Czech approval, similar to the German annexation of the Sudetenland. Local communists, without Soviet direct backing, came to power in Albania and Yugoslavia. The unelected and communist-controlled governments of Eastern Europe created a major problem for Soviet relations with the Western powers and started the Cold War in 1945. Repeated negotiations at Potsdam and later in 1945-46 at several foreign ministers' conferences failed to resolve the issue. The United States, Great Britain, and France wanted democratic elections, and Stalin wanted communist-controlled and pro-Soviet regimes in power. Stalin temporarily allowed free elections in Hungary to placate the West, but as the Cold War hardened in 1946, he displaced the non-communist government and in 1948 staged a coup in Czechoslovakia, replacing a democratically elected coalition government. While the rhetoric hardened in 1946, Stalin was actually more amenable for a time to compromise, but that chance of stopping the freezing of the Cold War slipped away by the end of 1946. the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin made clear his intentions for the Polish government and Polish boundaries, although he was a bit more restrained by German territory to be given to the Poles. He agreed to enter the war 90 days after Victory in Europe Day. At Yalta, agreements were made on the post-war division of Germany into zones of occupation. Churchill and Stalin agreed to Soviet domination of Mongolia and return of Russian territory taken by the Japanese in 1905. Both the American and Soviets agreed to a coalition government in China of the nationalists and communists. At this point, Stalin did not trust Mao or his abilities and was willing to work with Great Britain and the U.S. to support a Chinese government dominated by the nationalists but friendly to the Soviet Union. Stalin agreed to support the United Nations, but made absurd demands that he have a vote for each Soviet republic. In the end, the West gave him 3 votes for the fiction that the Ukraine and White Russia, now Belarus, were independent. Later, Republicans would criticize the Yalta agreements as a sellout to the Soviet Union and argue that FDR sold Eastern Europe and China to Stalin in Yalta. This is the charge Republicans would raise in the 1948, 1950, and 1952 elections, and some conservatives would continue to blame FDR for the communization of Eastern Europe through the 1960s. When Harry Truman became president, he decided he would try to work with Stalin, but took a tougher stand in private meetings with Soviet representatives, demanding in April 1945 that Stalin live up to the Yalta agreements. American advisors to Truman were split between those who thought the U.S. could preserve some kind of relationship with Stalin in the post-war world, and those who felt that Stalin's ambitions in Eastern Europe made that unlikely. Advisors like Harry Hopkins, Henry Wallace, and Joseph P. Davies felt there was still hope for cooperation with the Soviet Union, while George Kennan, Harriman, Leahy, Forrestal, and Baruch questioned Stalin's intentions. The conflicting suggestions to compromise with Stalin or confront him led to President Truman to weave back and forth in 1945 and 46 between trying to deal with Stalin at Potsdam and frustration at Soviet actions that he viewed as a violation of the Yalta and Potsdam meetings. Truman came out of the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 with mixed feelings about his ability to work with Stalin. The contradictory advice that Truman received from his advisors and his mixed experiences in meeting with Stalin may explain why it became difficult to capitalize on Stalin's brief willingness to placate the West in the late 1945 and part of 1946, since both sides may have missed the signals that there was a limited window of opportunity in the emerging Cold War to strike a possible compromise semi-acceptable to both sides. The Cold War trends could be seen in 1946. Stalin gave a rare public speech in February of 1946 in which he ranted about the inability of communism and capitalism to coexist. Some American observers saw the speech as simply one to rally public support in the Soviet Union for continued sacrifices in the post-war era. Most Americans, however, saw this as the most warlike speech since VJ Day and the opening announcement of the Cold War. A week later, a story broke of a Soviet-sponsored spy ring in Canada involving 22 people trying to spy on American atomic secrets. In February 1946, George Kennan sent his famous long cable analyzing the sources of Soviet conduct, arguing that Stalin needed an outside enemy to justify his totalitarian control, and nothing we could do would change Soviet behavior. The West had to remain firm and resist Soviet political pressure until changes took place within the Soviet Union, essentially what later became known as the containment policy that guided American foreign policy from 1947 to 1989. Then in March, Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech on the 5th in Missouri, articulating the end of wartime cooperation with the Soviet Union and the division of Europe from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic into communist and non-communist Europe. To add weight to Churchill's concern, the Soviets, who had allowed relatively free elections in Hungary after the war, began to put pressure on the non-communist leaders to push them out of power by the middle of 1946 and eliminated all non-communist political parties. The one area where it appeared Stalin offered compromise was in Iran. After refusing to withdraw Soviet troops and supporting secessionist ethnic groups like the Azeris and Kurds, Stalin agreed to negotiate with the Iranian government in 1946 and obey the proposal of the United Nations to withdraw. However, by the summer of 1946, President Truman decided the time had come to act to stop Soviet pressure on Turkey to cede military bases and support for communist rebels in Greece. This led President Truman to issue the Truman Doctrine in 1947, pledging American aid to nations threatened by domestic armed minorities or foreign aggression. This became the basis for the containment policy as the United States provided Greece and Turkey with over $400 million in aid to resist the Soviets. The Cold War had begun. Kennan articulated this policy publicly in an unnamed article under Mr. X in 1947, in which he summarized the sources of Soviet conduct and argued for the containment policy as the American and Western response.